In 1900, heart disease was rare. Obesity was rare. Type 2 diabetes was so uncommon that most physicians would go their entire careers without seeing a single case. Cancer rates were a fraction of what they are today. Autoimmune conditions were medical curiosities rather than everyday diagnoses. 125 years later, heart disease is a leading cause of death in America. Nearly 3/4 of American adults are overweight or obese. More than 130 million Americans have diabetes or prediabetes. Autoimmune conditions have tripled in the last few decades. We are the most chronically ill, wealthy nation on Earth, despite spending more on healthcare than any country in human history. Something happened. It wasn't bad luck, it wasn't genetics, it wasn't laziness or moral failure or lack of personal responsibility. It was a series of deliberate decisions made by scientists, politicians, food corporations, and agricultural interests that fundamentally transformed what Americans eat over the course of about 75 years. This is that story, and I want you to be angry by the end of it, because this, quite frankly, deserves some anger. I'm David, and this is Undomesticated. Before we talk about what went wrong, I want to paint a picture of what American eating looked like before the industrial food system took over, because I think a lot of people have lost the reference point entirely. In the early 1900s, most Americans ate food that would be broadly recognizable by their great-great-grandparents. Meat, including organ meats, liver, heart, and kidney, were staples of the American diet and were eaten regularly across economic classes. Animal fats were the primary cooking fats: lard, tallow, butter, and schmaltz. These have been the cooking fats of human civilization for thousands of years and were deeply embedded in every culinary tradition on Earth. Vegetables were seasonal and largely local. Fermented foods, sauerkrauts, pickles, and fermented dairy were common preservation methods that happened to be extraordinarily good for gut health. Sourdough bread made through traditional long fermentation was fundamentally different from what we now call bread. Whole milk, cream, and full-fat dairy were unquestioned staples. People cooked, not as a hobby or a lifestyle statement, but as a basic life skill that virtually every household practiced as a matter of necessity. Food was grown locally, preserved at home, and prepared from recognizable whole ingredients. Was this diet perfect? Well, no. Poverty created real nutritional deficiencies in some populations. Access to food was not equal. But the diseases that are now killing us in epidemic numbers, the obesity, the diabetes, the heart disease, the autoimmune conditions, these were not the primary health crises of that era. Then things started to change, and they changed faster than most people realize. The first wave of industrial food transformation happened in the late 1800s to early 1900s, and it centered on two things: refined flour and refined sugar. Roller milling technology, developed in the late 1800s, made it possible to produce white flour at industrial scale at a fraction of the cost of traditional stone-ground whole grain flour. White flour had always been a luxury. It required labor-intensive sifting to remove the bran and the germ. Industrial roller milling made it cheap and ubiquitous almost overnight. The problem is that when you remove the bran and germ from wheat, you remove most of the fiber, most of the vitamins and minerals, and most of the nutritional value. What you're left with is essentially pure starch, a substance that behaves almost identically to sugar in the human body. The rapid rise in refined flour consumption in the early 1900s was one of the first significant departures from the ancestral food environment, and its consequences showed up almost immediately in the form of widespread vitamin deficiency, diseases like pellagra, conditions so severe that the government eventually mandated that refined flour be refortified with synthetic vitamins to replace the ones that had been milled out. We created a food product so nutritionally bankrupt that it caused widespread deficiency diseases. And rather than question whether we should be eating it, we added synthetic vitamins back in and called it enriched. Sugar consumption followed a similar trajectory. Per capita sugar consumption in America went from about 6 pounds per year in 1822 to about 100 pounds per year by the early 1900s. The industrial sugar industry made sweetness cheap and available in a way that had never been before in human history. And our ancient brains, wired to seek out the rare sweetness of ripe fruit, had absolutely no defense against it. But the transformation that I think had the most profound and lasting consequences was the rise of industrial seed oils. This is a story I don't think most people know, and that I think is absolutely critical to understanding the chronic disease epidemic we're living in. For virtually all of human history, the fats human cooked with and ate were animal fats: lard, tallow, butter, suet, and a small number of traditionally pressed plant oils like olive and coconut. These fats have been a part of the human diet for hundreds of thousands of years. Our bodies knew exactly what to do with them. In the early 1900s, a company called Procter& Gamble developed a process called hydrogenation that allowed them to take cheap liquid cottonseed oil, an industrial byproduct that had previously been used as a lubricant and lamp fuel, and turn it into a solid white fat that looked remarkably like lard. They called it Crisco, launched it in 1911, and marketed it aggressively as a modern, clean, scientific alternative to dirty animal fats. This was the birth of the industrial seed oil industry, and it was built entirely on marketing rather than science. There was no evidence that cottonseed oil was better for human health than lard. There was no evidence it was safe for long-term human consumption. It was cheap, it was shelf-stable, it was profitable, and it could be marketed as modern and progressive in an era when Americans were deeply enamored with science and technology. The hydrogenation process also created trans fats, a form of fat that does not exist in nature, and that we now know is genuinely toxic to human cardiovascular health. Trans fats would remain a staple of the American food supply for most of the 20th century before finally being banned by the FDA in 2015, after killing an estimated 50,000 Americans per year for decades. Now, here's where the story gets kind of dark, because what I've described so far was largely market driven, food companies finding cheap ingredients and selling them to consumers. What happened next involved the deliberate corruption of nutritional science and government policy in ways that redirected the entire trajectory of American health. The central figure in this story is a physiologist named Ansel Keys. Keys was brilliant, ambitious, politically savvy, and most certainly wrong about the most important question he devoted his career to answering. In the 1950s, Keys became convinced that dietary saturated fat, the kind of fat found in animal foods like meat, butter, and eggs, was the primary cause of heart disease. He based his conclusion initially on a study called the Six Countries Study, which appeared to show a correlation between fat consumption and heart disease rates across, well, 6 countries. The problem was that Keys had data from 22 countries, and he cherry-picked the 6 that supported his hypothesis. When researchers later analyzed all 22 countries, the correlation essentially disappeared. The data did not support his conclusion. Keys knew this and chose to ignore it. But Keys was not just a scientist. He was a political operator who understood how to build consensus and marginalize opposition. He used his considerable influence to have researchers who disagreed with him removed from important advisory committees. He attacked critics personally and professionally. He dominated the conversation about dietary fat for decades through sheer force of will and political maneuvering. And he found he had a very responsive audience in the American Heart Association, which in 1961 issued guidelines recommending that Americans replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated vegetable oils, the very seed oils that were being produced at industrial scale by food companies. The food industry, which had been struggling to convince Americans to abandon traditional animal fats for their cheaper industrial alternatives, suddenly had the recommendation of the American Heart Association behind their products. The symbiosis between the food industry and nutritional science that was established in this era has really never gone away. It just got more sophisticated. Then came 1977 and the McGovern Report, formerly called the Dietary Goals for the United States. This is where the government policy entered the picture in a way that affected every American, regardless of whether they were paying attention to nutritional science. Senator George McGovern convened a state Senate committee. Senator George McGovern convened a Senate assembly. Senator George McGovern convened a Senate committee to develop national dietary guidelines. The committee was staffed largely by political staffers with little nutritional science background. They consulted with Keys and his allies, and they produced a document that recommended Americans drastically reduce their consumption of dietary fat, particularly saturated fat, and replace it with carbohydrates. The cattle industry, the dairy industry, the egg industry all pushed back hard on the science, and they were right to. The science did not support the recommendations, but they lost the political battle, and the guidelines were issued. These guidelines became the foundation to the USDA food pyramid, that iconic image that generations of American schoolchildren were taught as nutritional gospel, with grains at the base, fats at the top to be used sparingly. It was not based on sound science. It was based on the flawed hypothesis that had already been challenged within the scientific community. And it shaped what Americans ate, what schools served, what hospitals fed patients, and what the food industry produced for the next 40 years. The 1980s and 1990s were the golden age of low-fat everything. Fat grams were counted obsessively. Low-fat labels were slapped on products that had no business being called health food. Snackwell cookies, essentially pure sugar and refined flour, became a phenomenon because they were low-fat. And Americans got fatter. Dramatically, rapidly, consistently fatter. This should have been the signal that the hypothesis was wrong. If dietary fat causes obesity and heart disease, then reducing dietary fat should reduce obesity and heart disease. Instead, the opposite happened. As fat consumption went down, carbohydrate consumption went up, because something has to replace the calories. And the obesity epidemic accelerated. Here's what actually happened physiologically. When you remove fat from food, it tastes terrible. Food manufacturers knew this, so they replaced the fat with sugar, refined carbohydrates, and a vast array of chemical additives to restore palatability. Low-fat yogurt, low-fat salad dressing, low-fat everything, all loaded with sugar to compensate for the removal of fat. Meanwhile, the demonization of dietary fat had cleared the path for industrial seed oils to completely dominate the American food supply. Butter was out. Margarine, made from partially hydrogenated vegetable oil and loaded with trans fats, was in. Lard was at. Lard was out. Crisco was in. Tallow was out. Soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil in. Everywhere, in everything. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in the American diet shifted dramatically during this period. Humans evolved eating a ratio of roughly 1-to-1, at most 4-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. Industrial seed oils are almost entirely omega-6. The modern American diet now has a ratio estimated at somewhere between 15-to-1 and 20-to-1. This extreme imbalance drives chronic systemic inflammation. And chronic systemic inflammation is the underlying mechanism of virtually every chronic illness that is killing us. This is not a fringe position. This is well documented in the peer-reviewed literature. The seed oil problem is one of the most important and underappreciated drivers of the chronic disease epidemic, and it's something I will be dedicated an entire episode to in the near future. While the fat wars were playing out, another transformation was happening quietly in the food supply that would prove equally devastating. High-fructose corn syrup was developed in the 1960s and began appearing in American food products in the 1970s. By the 1980s, it had largely replaced cane sugar in soft drinks and processed foods because it was significantly cheaper, a consequence of the corn subsidies built into the US Farm Bill that made corn one of the most artificially cheap commodities in the world. Fructose is metabolized differently than glucose. While glucose can be used by virtually every cell in the body, fructose is processed almost entirely by the liver. In amounts found in whole fruit, which also comes with fiber, water, and a complex array of polynutrients, in the amounts found in whole fruit, which also comes with fiber, water, and a complex array of phytonutrients, this is not really a problem. In the concentrated amounts found in sweetened beverages and processed foods, consumed at the scale that Americans now consume them, fructose drives liver fat accumulation, insulin resistance, and metabolic dysfunction in ways that are now very well documented. The average American now consumes somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds of added sugar per year, much of it as high fructose corn syrup. Our ancient metabolisms, designed for the rare sweetness of ripe seasonal fruit and honey, are being asked to process an almost incomprehensible sugar load every single day. But perhaps the most sinister development of the modern food era was not a single ingredient. It was the emergence of food engineering as a deliberate science of addiction. In the 1990s and 2000s, food companies began investing heavily in what they called the bliss point, the precise combination of sugar, fat, and salt that maximizes palatability and drives overconsumption. This is not speculation or conspiracy theory. It is documented in detail in Michael Moss's book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and in the testimony of former food industry insiders. Food scientists at major corporations were explicitly tasked with engineering products that bypassed the normal satiety signals that tell us when we've had enough. They studied brain imaging to understand the neurological reward responses were different to different flavor combinations. They engineered textures designed to disappear in the mouth, what they called vanishing caloric density, so that the brain never registered fullness. They deliberately calibrated salt, sugar, and fat to hit the bliss point with mathematical precision. This is not food. This is a drug delivery system dressed up as food. And it was designed by very smart people with enormous resources, specifically to override your biological self-regulation. Blaming people for overeating this stuff is like blaming someone for getting addicted to opioids when they were prescribed by their doctor. The product was engineered to be addictive. I want to spend a few minutes on something that rarely gets discussed in health conversations, but underlies everything I've been talking about: the political economy of the American food system. The US Farm Bill, passed and renewed by Congress roughly every 5 years, is one of the most consequential pieces of legislation most Americans have never really heard of. It determines which crops receive government subsidies, which agricultural practices are supported, and ultimately what food is cheap and available in America. Corn, soy, wheat, and cotton receive the overwhelming majority of Farm Bill subsidies. These are the raw materials of the industrial processed food system. Corn becomes high fructose corn syrup and corn oil and corn fed factory farmed meat. Soy becomes soybean oil and soy protein isolate and the feed for industrial livestock. Wheat becomes the refined flour in virtually every packaged product on grocery stores. Meanwhile, fruits, vegetables, and the diverse whole foods that humans actually need to be healthy receive a tiny fraction of Farm Bill support. The result is a food environment where the least healthy options are artificially cheap, and the most nutritious options are artificially expensive. When people say eating healthy is too expensive, they're not wrong, but they're identifying a symptom rather than the cause. Eating healthy is expensive in America because our agricultural policy has been captured by commodity crop interests and has deliberately made the building blocks of junk food cheaper and the building blocks of real food way more expensive. This is a political problem as much as a health problem. And it's why the ancestral health and regenerative agriculture communities need to be talking to each other and working together. Because fixing the food system requires changing the political and economic structures that are producing it. So here's where all this has left us. The United States spends more on healthcare than any nation on earth, over $4 trillion per year. And we are amongst the sickest wealthy populations on the planet in terms of chronic disease burden. 74% of American adults are overweight or obese. 37 million have diabetes. 96 million have prediabetes. Heart disease kills more Americans than any other cause. Autoimmune conditions have tripled in recent decades. Depression and anxiety are at epidemic levels. Chronic pain is near universal. And the conventional medical response to this catastrophe is to manage symptoms with pharmaceuticals. Statins for cholesterol, metformin and insulin for diabetes, antidepressants for depression, blood pressure medications for hypertension. These drugs save lives in acute situations, and I'm not dismissing their value in crisis management. But they do not address why people are sick. They manage the consequences of a broken food and lifestyle environment without changing that environment. The good news that I want to end on, because there genuinely is good news, is that the body is remarkably resilient. The chronic diseases that have been produced by decades of industrial food and sedentary living are largely reversible through dietary and lifestyle intervention. The research on this is clear and growing stronger every year. We did not get here by accident, but we can get out with intention. And that's what this show is about. I want to leave you with this thought. The story I've told today is not a story about individual failure. It's not a story about weak willpower or poor personal choices made in a vacuum. It's a story about a food environment that was deliberately engineered to make people sick. Not out of malice necessarily, but out of profit motive and political convenience that has been defended and perpetuated by the industries that benefit from it. Understanding that story matters, because when you understand that the deck was stacked against you from the beginning, it changes the nature of the effort to reclaim your health. It's not about fixing your character. It's about deliberately opting out of a system that was never designed with your well-being in mind. That is what ancestral health is. That's what rewilding is. It's a conscious, deliberate decision to step outside the system and return to what actually works. This is Undomesticated. I'm David Atlas. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode. Please visit our website, podpage.com/undomesticated, sign up for our newsletter, take a look at our blog posts, and check out our sponsors. Using those sponsored links to purchase those products does give us a little bit of a kickback that helps us to produce more episodes for you. Thank you for joining us. I'll see you on the next one.